ringrazio voi per questo appuntamento prestigioso, il 7° convegno annuale della FUA, e quindi come Presidente della Commissione Cultura in particolare, ma porto il saluto del Sindaco Nardella che oggi si trova a Parigi. E tutti sappiamo e tutti conosciamo purtroppo gli eventi di questo ultimo mese, in particolare la difficoltà di parlarne noi tutti con le parole adeguate e non creando allarmismi, cercando di fare come fate voi con queste giornate dedicate che arrivano, penso, quando avete immaginato questo appuntamento, certo nessuno di noi immaginava di arrivare a una situazione così incandescente della nostra area politica, della nostra area geografica, del Mediterraneo e non solo. Come Comune di Firenze, come voi fate con tutti i vostri studenti, cerchiamo di essere vicini come istituzioni e associazioni a chi? Ai ragazzi che sono il nostro futuro, che sono quelli con cui dobbiamo relazionarci, quelli con cui forse negli ultimi anni non abbiamo avuto un modo di arrivare direttamente con un linguaggio che fosse più adeguato e moderno, anche perché forse i fatti, appunto, tornando al discorso di Parigi, dimostrano che un inceppamento e una problematica c'è stata anche di questo tipo, perché non solo terroristi, ma tanti ragazzi che sono nati e cresciuti in territori accolti, come noi facciamo, come è nostra cultura fare, accogliere, integrare questa parola importantissima che però oggi su cui tutti noi oggi siamo chiamati a riflettere in maniera importante. Quindi credo, dal punto di vista soprattutto delle istituzioni, ma vostro, che siete quelli che formano i nostri studenti, i nostri ragazzi, dico nostri perché i ragazzi oggi si sentono a casa in tutte le parti del mondo, c'è questa cosa bellissima, soprattutto a livello europeo. Noi continuiamo a discutere di politica, ma i ragazzi sono sempre più avanti e le nuove tecnologie aiutano in questo, e quindi dobbiamo misurarci con un nuovo sistema, anche noi tutti che parliamo, che relazioniamo, che facciamo politica, che facciamo cultura, cercare di arrivare in modo più profondo a questi ragazzi. Ecco, io penso la riflessione vera oggi, e quindi vi ringrazio per quello che andrete a fare in questi 2 giorni così importanti di Re Mediterranea, torno a dire mai come oggi così attuale, per arrivare insieme a trovare chiavi di lettura diverse e comunque per conoscere e per lanciare questi famosi ponti che sono indispensabili, inderogabili, assolutamente non ne possiamo fare a meno da sempre, oggi ancora meno. Siamo Firenze, la città di Lapira, abbiamo ripetuto un'esperienza importante, anche noi quando l'avevamo programmata, la riunione dei sindaci dello scorso novembre. Non pensavamo di arrivare a un appuntamento convocando, sono arrivate 60 delegazioni, in un momento così attuale del dibattito è importante e difficile, perché anche muoversi oggigiorno è diventato complicato, però sulla scia proprio dell'insegnamento della Pira era questo il senso che il sindaco Nardella ha voluto dare a quelle giornate. Come state facendo voi con questa riflessione più ampia e che aiuta tutti noi a capire il prima per arrivare al poi e per arrivare a un nostro futuro condiviso, e torno a dire soprattutto con questa grande responsabilità e grande bellezza di arrivare ai ragazzi. Quindi grazie davvero a voi per queste 2 giornate così importanti. L'amministrazione, nelle nostre capacità e nella nostra volontà, è sempre di esservi al fianco e di collaborare al meglio.
Il gabinetto VSE, che nasce in una Firenze che caratterizza l'età che in Europa viene detta l'età della restaurazione, ovvero dopo l'età napoleonica, ecco che i vari stati ritrovano la loro conformazione, e quindi viene abitualmente considerata un'età, come dire, di decadenza o di eccessiva austerità. In realtà per la Toscana fu l'età che meglio di altre caratterizzò la Toscana della tolleranza, del dialogo, della apertura, quando il mondo dava la sensazione, anche come reazione alla rivoluzione, alle temperie dell'età napoleonica, di chiudersi. Ecco che in quel periodo in Toscana, con il rientro prima del Granduca Ferdinando III e poi con il figlio Leopoldo II, si aprono nuovi fermenti. E quindi la Toscana vede a Firenze la fondazione della Cassa di risparmio, con valori etici nel fare banca, siamo nel 1829, vede il rilancio dell'Accademia di Georgofili, che è l'istituzione attraverso cui tutte le attività scientifiche, soprattutto legate alla produzione nell'agricoltura, trovano il riferimento per l'innovazione, la creazione di nuove tecniche, di nuovi macchinari, e vede questo strano ma bravissimo, colto personaggio, il VSE, che viene da Oneglia e quindi viene da quella che oggi è la parte della Liguria più aperta verso la cultura francese, che fonda a Firenze, siamo nel 1819, la prima riunione di questa istituzione sarà il 25 gennaio del 1820, un gabinetto di cultura che vuole tutte le riviste che provengono da ogni parte d'Europa, vuole i libri che rappresentano un po' i fermenti della cultura europea di quel periodo, e quindi tutti i grandi viaggiatori, non siamo ancora nel turismo di massa, ma siamo nel turismo del Grand Tour, ovvero di persone facoltosi o di nobile famiglia che hanno il tempo per dedicarsi anche al giro d'Europa o del mondo, vedono nel gabinetto VSE il loro riferimento. Perché voi potete pensare a chi viene dagli Stati Uniti, a chi viene dall'Inghilterra, viene a Firenze, ne gode le bellezze, ma vuole rimanere collegato e aggiornato su quello che avviene nel suo luogo di origine. E qui viene e trova le sue riviste, trova i suoi giornali, magari che arrivano a distanza di qualche giorno, ma danno comunicazione con il proprio paese. E non è un caso che proprio fin dall'inizio il gabinetto VSE diventa un riferimento. Allora l'Italia era divisa in stati, quindi diamo una visione internazionale, ma non è un caso che nel 1827 due grandi personalità di quello che sarà la letteratura italiana, Giacomo Leopardi, che viene dal Recanati, quindi Stato Pontificio, e il Manzoni, colui che diventerà con i Promessi Sposi un riferimento qualche decennio dopo, quando si costituisce l'Italia, il 3 di settembre è documentato dal Libro dei Soci, si incontrano per la prima volta al gabinetto VSE, una seduta letteraria del 3 di settembre del 1827. Così come noi troviamo qui, in quel Libro dei Soci, un po' il viaggio di tante personalità che vengono da fuori. Ad esempio per Dostoevskij, che a Firenze scriverà L'Idiota, abitando in Piazza Pitti, sono numerosissime giorno per giorno le firme sul Libro dei Soci. Significa che le sue riflessioni, la sua biblioteca, il luogo dove veniva a comporre ciò che diventerà un caposaldo della letteratura russa e europea, è maturato qua. E potrei farvi tantissimi esempi. Ecco, mi fa piacere quindi questa scelta così intelligente per un'università, un'istituzione culturale a cui io mi sento legato e che sta svolgendo una funzione molto molto importante a Firenze, e io vi ringrazio, che proprio nel parlare nella conferenza annuale di Re Mediterranea, e questo è un riferimento quanto mai attuale oggi, quanto mai importante oggi, voi possiate incontrarvi qua. Del resto noi abbiamo oggi un comune obiettivo, quello di creare la rete dei paesi che vivono la civiltà come sviluppo, come affermazione della vita, come affermazione dell'uomo, nel momento in cui sentiamo la nostra vita condizionata dal terrorismo e dall'integralismo fanatico di chi vorrebbe riportarci indietro nei secoli. Ecco che proprio per questo il fatto che si svolgano occasioni annuali come questo, nei baluardi di quello che fa l'affermazione della cultura e della civiltà europea, partendo dalla nostra Firenze, è qualcosa di veramente molto importante. Un'ultima battuta. Qualcuno dice Firenze cerca oggi di aprirsi alle istituzioni culturali con una logica che vuole essere quella della circolazione delle persone, anche del beneficio economico. Ecco, Firenze non è questo. Quando Firenze diventò capitale d'Italia, 150 anni fa, aveva 100.000 abitanti e 5.000 su 100.000 abitanti, quando non esisteva il turismo, 150 anni fa, su 100.000 abitanti 5.000 erano persone che stavano a Firenze con stabilità e venivano dai paesi anglosassoni. Questo è dimostrazione di un rapporto, di un ombelico che è così profondo che va al di là della temperia dei tempi. Questa è una città in cui la cultura latina con la cultura anglosassone si è trovata come in nessun altro luogo e quindi io mi sento davvero contento che con occasioni di prestigio e di qualità come quella che voi vivete stamani possa rinnovarsi questo sentimento e questa vocazione che guarda al futuro. Grazie.
I want to tell you this is truly an honor to be here. I was asked many months ago if I would like to attend the conference, which was an honor in itself, and then to be the keynote speaker. I am on the faculty in the Department of Nutrition and Food Studies at New York University. And I teach a lot of nutrition courses. I also happen to be very, very privileged, and this is where the connection is and why I'm here today, because I direct a study abroad program in Florence. NYU has a campus, but we've taken many courses at FUA. And so I want to tell you a little bit about my relationship with the Mediterranean diet. And when I was thinking of what I wanted to discuss, I thought I could only discuss what I've experienced. And I can't be wrong, you may not agree, but it's my opinion, because when it comes to food and diet, there's so much I could have discussed, the history, but I don't know if we would be touching these topics. So I thought there's one topic that no one's going to discuss, and that will be my experience of the Mediterranean diet. So when I was thinking about this talk, it really gave me an opportunity to think about how did I become interested in food, nutrition, and then eventually so interested in the Mediterranean diet, especially in Italy. I went back around 30 years ago, and it was like psychotherapy. I was starting to think, and I was backpacking. As a teenager, I had the Euro ticket, and I went out to all these countries. It was the first time I think I left the States. And I remember when I went to Greece, it was the first time I ever tasted a cucumber. I thought, wow, cucumbers don't taste like this in New York. It was the most amazing taste. And then I was in Israel, and I tasted a tomato, and I never tasted a tomato so delicious, so sweet, so flavorful. And I remember the melon in Italy. That was the outstanding fruit. We don't have fruits that taste like this. It was just flavors I've never experienced. And I realized, well, if the fruit and the vegetables taste good, that's probably why the food is so delicious. And that may be also why, unlike the States, now this is all my opinion, but so you may be from different parts of the States and not feel this way, that so many of our dishes are smothered in sauce. Loving food and wanting to explore it more, the culinary arts, and nutrition. And I really think it was that taste, my first taste of the cucumber in Greece, that sort of solidified this. So I thought I'd do a little chronology of a parallel of my experiences in Italy and sort of parallel to what is happening in food and nutrition and diet trends. So we're going to go back. So we got to think about how things were about 12, 13 years ago. And if I go back to when I first came to Italy, I remember that just how everything was so clear to me, why the Mediterranean diet was such a healthy diet. Now, we're not going back to the 1950s when the work of Ansel Keys was exploring the health benefits. I'm talking about, like 15 years ago, 13 years ago. And there was something really, really special about the foods in Italy. They were eating food. People were eating whole foods. They weren't eating food products. People were sitting down and having meals. That was something that really stood out when I was here. in Manhattan, it's so common to see people just walking down the street, eating their meals, drinking their beverages. And it's become so common to eat everywhere in the States, especially in New York. I remember when I walked into Macy's, it's a huge department store in New York. When I was a little girl and I used to shop in Macy's, you never would enter Macy's with food. And now every floor has a restaurant, Cinnabon. Everywhere you go, there's food in Macy's. Barnes & Noble's, a bookstore, you have food. You go into a store like Staples where they sell office supplies. And I just didn't understand why when you enter Staples, the first thing you see is not office supplies, it's huge boxes of candy. And I just couldn't get it. Like, why, when I enter Staples to buy paper, whatever, why is candy, huge boxes like what you see in the movie theater, why is that the first thing I see? And then I asked one of the employees there, and they said, because you're supposed to buy it for your employers. So you bring it back, you bring it to work, and you have candy at work. And I thought, oh, we're doomed. I mean, I never even thought of that connection. So I'm always reflecting of how things are in the States and how things are in Italy. And I think sometimes it's very important and interesting to have an outsider observe your country, because I'll probably notice things that you don't notice or you don't think are important. So I've noticed many things about Italy that I think, or at least Florence, that make it so, so special. So in all the years I was doing the study abroad program, which I'll talk about in a few more details in a moment, in Italy, I would come back to the States and I became the go-to person for journalists and the media to ask questions about the Italian diet or Mediterranean diet. So if we go back like around 12 years ago, I recall it was about, let's say in 2003, it was when the Atkins diet, South Beach diet were at their peak. Now, I always say diets are like fashion. You know, wait long enough, they come back. Because I remember South Beach or Atkins when I was a kid. And it was the Scarsdale diet then, but it doesn't matter. The name changes, but it's reinvented. And when I came back from Italy, and the new thing is you don't eat carbs. The Atkins diet was no carbs. And here I was in Italy in a culture that is, you know, immersed in carbohydrates. And we know that Italians had some of the best health outcomes. And when we look at the original work of Ansel Keys and of the foods that they studied, it was a very carbohydrate-rich diet. So there's different types of carbohydrate. So all the journalists used to ask me, how could the Italians be so healthy and yet they still eat pasta, or they still eat pizza, or they eat tomatoes. Poor tomatoes got caught in that carb craze, by the way. Watermelon got caught, and tomatoes, you were supposed to, you know, red light was for watermelon, tomatoes were red because you should stop, you shouldn't eat so many because it's carbohydrates. It was crazy back then. And I remember going into supermarkets and there were aisles that had low-carb olive oil. I'm telling you, this is serious. I couldn't even make this up. They had high-protein pasta, which was crazy because you were by doing this, you were really removing yourself from the essence of the Mediterranean diet, which was eating whole foods that weren't highly processed. It wasn't taking pasta and throwing chickpea flour in it. Barilla did that to increase the protein. So it was crazy what was going on, all these questions I was getting about the Mediterranean diet. No one could understand why were Italians healthy, but they were eating all these forbidden foods. And then to the typical American, this is actually a question I ask my students the first day they come to Italy, to write 4 things that come to mind when I say Mediterranean diet. And after 3 weeks of exploring the Mediterranean diet and culture, I ask them the same question to see the difference. And typically, the first few foods that anyone will pick that hasn't experienced the diet in the country, they'll say pasta, olive oil, and wine. Those are the 3 traditional. So wine became a hot topic. And a lot of journalists would ask me, is it possible, because wine has a lot of calories, instead of drinking wine, could we take resveratrol, which is a chemical in wine, which may have health benefits? So instead of having all those calories, popping a pill, would that be the same? Because everyone was in search of the chemicals that were in the foods, not the foods. And these questions would just make my blood boil. Like, no, it's not about popping resveratrol. The reason why Italians can eat bread and pasta is that they don't sit down before the waiter even comes to take their order and finish the bread basket and then ask the waiter for a second basket, like we do. See, I could say that because I'm American. We do that. It goes with the meal. You have a little. Italians drink wine. Wine is a food. Wine is not abused. It's part of the culture. And you have wine with your meal. Not a lot. It's not abusive. You don't drink, get drunk. It's not binge drinking. You have it as part of your meal. That's where the health benefits are. I don't know if drinking wine at 11 o'clock without eating a meal is healthy, but the research shows that when you do eat a meal and you have a little bit of wine, there may be health benefits related to it. So it's in the context. But like the typical American reaction is to look for something quick, a quick fix. They don't want to hear the truth about what is the Mediterranean diet. So I was getting all these questions about olive oil, like how could Italians use olive oil and they're not obese? And it's like, because they're using good quality ingredients. The olive oil tastes, you don't need so much because it's so tasty and flavorful. It's a condiment in Italy more than anything else, olive oil. And they use fresh herbs to flavor their food. And they have really little refrigerators. They don't have those huge Sub-Zeros. So they need to go shopping often. And they don't go once a month to Costco and buy, broccoli that is about the size of this table, so after like a week, it's already deteriorated. There are many other facets to the Italian way of life that contribute to this. So this is going back around 12 years ago when I was getting all those calls from journalism, because it was also the same time with the French paradox, was why French could eat cheese and drink wine and they're not overweight. So all these things were happening. So you got to go back around 12 years ago because my responses then were very extreme. I sounded very strange because I wasn't talking about nutrients. I wasn't talking about supplements. I was talking about things like Italians sit down and have a meal. They sit down. That's important. That the Mediterranean diet is not a diet, it's a way of life. It's a lifestyle. It's not a diet. It's not olive oil, wine, and pasta. End it. The Mediterranean diet, first of all, is made up of countries along the Mediterranean, and the one thing they have in common is olive trees. And so, pasta may be something that they consume in Italy, but they don't consume pasta in Spain. It's rice, or it's couscous, even in Sicily. So, and the food is local. I know that's changed, but it still was local. In America, you can get any vegetable any time of the year, and I can guarantee you most kids have no idea what season asparagus or artichokes are in season. It's changing. Here, it's very unnatural. You don't eat artichokes when they're not in season. So you didn't even know, you guys, that you were sustainable. You were just sustainable without even knowing it because it was just how you grew up. You went to the open air markets. You knew your vendor, still do. Many people still shop that way. And you ate fruits and vegetables that were grown in soil where maybe you grew up. Or you ate fruits and vegetables that are in season. It tastes better. It's fresher. And the other thing, and the reason that the cucumber was so delicious in Greece and the melon in Italy is because fruits and vegetables ripen in the sun. Unlike the States, and again, I don't mean to make generalizations, but in the States, they're picked before they ripen, and quite often they're ripened and gassed to ripen them so they could transport hundreds, thousands of miles. Whereas here, so many of the fruits and vegetables are naturally ripened by the heat of the sun, and that makes a big difference in the flavor and the taste. So when I ate that delicious, delicious melon in Italy, it was so rich in flavor because it was naturally ripened by the sun, just the way nature intended us to eat. The other things was that portions aren't huge here. Let's go to the pasta. Okay, we went out to dinner last night, so this blows my theory because we got a bowl of risotto that I've never seen in Italy. But in the States, you could take a bath in your bowl of pasta, literally, or at least soak your feet. Here, it's a small portion. It's usually the first portion you get. You have a small plate of it. That's why. You know, then the high glycemic index became big and all this craziness, as though no one could eat pasta any longer. You know, like Italians don't have elevated rates of diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and if there's any connection between pasta and diet and culture, it's Italians. But they're not eating huge portions. So portions. Italians don't snack all the time. It's a very American thing, and I don't think it's very Italian. And I know things are changing, but in America, people think they should be snacking all the time. I can't tell you how many journalists call me, and I stopped taking these questions. Give us 25 snacks you could eat during the day. You know, they always want numbers, like what are the 10 best snacks you could have after breakfast? And my response is, why do we always have to snack after a meal? Why is snacking such a part of our culture and not so much in Italy? Why? Because Italians sit down and have a meal. They sit down and they have hopefully a pleasurable meal, and they're eating real food. They're not eating fat-free gorgonzola, which is tasteless, like wax. So all you want to do is you're in search of something tasty because you're eating all this fat-free, sugar-free, for the most part, quite often tasteless foods. So that was very, very important. And Italians grow up with food memories. To me, this is one of the most important things. And that is so important in terms of your health because you grow up with memories from certain aromas. You know, your sense of smell is linked to memory. That's why when we smell things, it brings back memories. So if a child grows up eating processed foods, going to fast food restaurants, my biggest concern is, what will they cook if they have a family? What's their food memory? What aroma brings back memories? But in Italy, it's different. You do grow up with home-cooked meals, food memories, food aromas, and there's this connection to who you are, your identity, and what you eat. What's the identity of someone when they grow up eating fast foods, eating processed foods, and their definition of a home-cooked meal could be something that their mother put in the microwave and cooked. And this is just on the side, is I once went to a school in Brooklyn, and I was talking to all these kids, and I was asking them, how many kids have home-cooked meals where your mom prepares a meal? And they raised their hand, and practically every one of them considered a home-cooked meal a frozen food that their mom put in the oven. That was home-cooked because everything else was fast food or something brought into the house. And that's when I thought, this is so sad, and it just highlighted to me the difference between Italy and the States. So these are things I think quite often people don't think about. You know, Italians don't have to have Coca-Cola at every meal, sweetened beverages. And I once had a lecturer explain that it's very strange, it ruins the flavor of food, that when you have something sweet and then you eat something savory like pasta, it just doesn't, and they're so much more aware, I think, of flavor. Whereas for typical Americans, sweetened beverages is just natural. Right after they go from breast milk to formula, you go straight to Kool-Aid or Coca-Cola. And what happens is they always assume that when they're thirsty is something sweet. And they don't drink the water. You know, here you have your waters, your fizzy water or your natural still water. So to me, these were the things that were so important and overlooked. It wasn't about what nutrient, what phytochemical. It was more about a lifestyle. It was people walk. They walk to go shopping. They carry their bags. They take stairs. It's just an everyday part of your life that you're active. So these were the things that were, to me, so clearly different. And, you know, the contrast made me also think of a psychologist in the States. His name is Paul Rosen. And I love his work because he does a lot of comparative studies of the food attitudes of Americans and Europeans or Asians. And he says that, and I think I agree, is that Americans have a national eating disorder. And I have to agree. Because something else I do is I see a lot of patients privately for weight loss. I a host of other issues. So I really feel I have a pulse on, you know, eating behaviors in the States. And he says that we're obsessed with Americans are so obsessed with calories, grams of fat, cholesterol, how much fiber, and all these other things, that we have such anxiety about eating that sometimes it supersedes the pleasure of food, the pleasure of a meal. But the paradox is we have some of the highest incidence of heart disease, diabetes, obesity. And yet it's with such angst when we eat, because sometimes we've lost any pleasure. We have guilt if we eat something that may have some, you know, fat in it. So it is so interesting, and there's so many reasons why that's beyond the scope of this conference as to why Americans have this national eating disorder. And it was such a pleasure to be here in a country where it is immersed in a food culture, where food is celebrated, where there's memories, where you sit down with your friends. It's very, very social experience. So what all of this led to, in terms of the study abroad course that I direct, is a project that I did. And in the study abroad course, it's that I direct, it's for 3 weeks, and we study food and food and diet, and we use actually food as a lens to understand Italian history, culture, the culinary arts, and health. And food is wonderful way to do this because, you know, it's so regional, the cuisine in Italy and the historical aspect. So I take about a group of, let's say, anywhere from 20 to 25 students, and we'll go back now the first couple of years in 2003-04 when I took these students. And I was noticing something, that students were in Italy for the first time, many of them, in this food-rich culture. And a lot of them had food anxiety. So Paul Rosen hit it on the head with his theory about Americans. Because all of a sudden, olive oil was put on the table and everyone was putting olive oil in their food. And people were eating pasta and people were eating all these foods. And I could sense that students were really feeling insecure because there was no labels to see exactly how many calories they were consuming. And I know the worst thing was there wasn't vending machines all over to get their Diet Coke. They were going crazy about that. I said, no, you're not getting Diet Coke when you're in Italy, so it's going to be hard to get it, not like the States. And a lot of them confess that this is difficult for them because we do so much eating and so much eating in public that they kind of felt a little uncomfortable. So, so it led me to do a little project that I think was in about 2007, 2008. And the project was to see if, after 3 weeks of being in this food-immersed program, would students' attitudes and behaviors about food, eating, dieting change? And so what I did is I had a survey, and I asked students prior to the course questions, and there were 4 categories. There were questions on their food shopping habits, mealtime and eating behaviors, their cooking behaviors, and their dieting and food restriction behaviors. So those were the 4 categories I asked them about. Now, if you go back to 2000 and I think 6 or 7 when I did this, open air markets where you buy your fruits and vegetables was not so big like it is today in the States. So we have to think back then. And then they were just getting off the whole Atkins craze. And the whole food movement and food activism wasn't big then either. And eating local or organic, it still wasn't like it is today. So these were the topics I chose to ask the students. And in the course in Italy, we have lots of lectures and lots of field trips, and students do research, and there's lots of hands-on activities. So the students really, really get immersed as much as possible in 3 weeks to the food culture here. And we have communal meals all the time. You know, with a lot of them are with our guest lecturers. And I've had some of the most famous Italian guest lecturers, and I could tell you each one talks about their food memories, which is always such a wonderful thing, because I can't imagine in America some of the guest lecturers I invite ever bringing up food memories of their childhood. So I asked students all these questions right after the program ended. I'm not going to go into the questions, but those were the categories. And then I thought something really important is I wanted to wait 6 months after they got home, because you know what it's like when you get home from Italy, like India, you know, you want a Tuscan kitchen, and you want, you know, you want to do, everything is changed for a while. You want to do yoga after India. So I thought, you know, we've got to wait 6 months. Let them settle back to their American ways. Let's see if being in Italy and experiencing this will make any difference. So I waited 6 months, even 6 months later. Is as a result of this program, they were purchasing and consuming more wine. Now, thank you, Massimo. No. Now. I was scared that NYU would be very disappointed with this program if the results now students are drinking more wine. But that was important because it was with dinner. And to me, it served as a proxy that it means they're sitting down now and eating a meal. You can't walk down the street and drink wine. So if you're sitting down and having a glass of wine, it meant that you're sitting down now, you're having a meal. So that to me, so that was the biggest change, the value of wine. The second thing is they were buying more local ingredients and cooking. The whole idea, like if we'll go to San Ambrogio Market or the San Lorenzo, and it was for many, the first time they saw this, knowing your vendor and buying, that was their third change that they made. And they were more interested in preparing meals, and that I need to thank Gabriella, because it was Apicius when we used to come to the culinary school and we took some cooking classes, and that had such an impact on them that they really wanted to learn more about cooking. And the main reason was the simplicity of the ingredients and what they created, because when no dish was more than 4 or 5 ingredients, and they created the most beautiful meals. It gave them such confidence in what they can do. So those were the 3 main changes. And it was 6 months after, and you know, I still see many of the students, and they all comment what a profound effect that this program, or at least being in Italy, had on their relationship with food. And many confessed that they were fat phobics before they came to Italy, and now they get it. They get, you know, olive oil, and that, you know, it's healthy, and that we shouldn't be eating a lot of fried foods and all these other things. So to me, that was very, very important. And so what I want to sort of leave with today is I know things are changing in Italy. I know it's not, I don't want to romanticize the diet. I know that there's lots of fast food, industrial foods, and all these other issues, but I do still think that the importance of a meal, and I still think there's many still wonderful qualities about the Italian diet and their relationship with food. And I do feel very optimistic in terms of the future of food and health. And the reason is that things are changing in the world. And I don't know if any of you went to the exhibition in Milan, but if you did, to me, the most memorable thing, or the thing that was most important, was the fact that the topic was about food and feeding the planet. There were like 120 countries from all over the world there. And it was all about eating local, all about energy, all about, you know, slow food was there. And I said, you know what? This is why this Milano exhibition expo is so important, because this is now the conversation. The conversation is about food and the future of food and of feeding the planet. And 10 years ago, it wasn't. 10 years ago, I was on the fringes when I spoke about eating local and when I spoke about shopping often or about huge portions and all these other issues. People didn't think that those were the qualities that were very, very important. And there are so many other changes. In terms of fast food, I can't tell you the changes that are being made. McDonald's is now going to be using cage-free eggs. I mean, 10 years ago, it was a joke to McDonald's. Tyson is not going to be using any type of chickens that had antibiotics. Tyson is a huge, huge chicken purveyor in the States. And then fast food restaurants, they're like Applebee's. These are huge chains. McDonald's, Burger King, I don't know if many of you heard of them, but they no longer serve soft drinks for kids. You can't get Coca-Cola or any of those drinks for kids. 10 years ago, that would have been a joke if I said it. No way. So things are changing. People are more aware of the connection of what they eat and the environment. People are more aware of where food comes from, about ingredients on a label, like all these things we're consuming, we can't even pronounce them. People are more aware of it. And food companies, in response, and it may not be because they care about the health of the population, it's simple economics. If people are more aware and they prefer to eat foods with less ingredients, then these big food producers are going to respond by making foods that consumers will purchase. So there are so many changes. In the States now, so many of the fast food restaurants have salads where the consumer actually orders exactly what they want in their salad, and they watch the preparer make it. And that's because it became more important to consumers to see their food, to see it being prepared. So now around NYU, where there used to be all these fast food restaurants, they're replaced by all these salad bars where you actually watch and point to what vegetables you want, you watch them chop it, and it's because they want to be involved in the food experience. So I could go on and on why I am optimistic that things are going to change, and I think that things will change also in Italy, and hopefully it'll go back to the Mediterranean diet as we know it, because the world is changing. And we understand about nutrition and sustainability issues now, and we understand more about the connection between what you eat. Food could promote health or cause disease. It's up to you. That's your choice. But food should be the greatest pleasure of our life. It is for me, at least. It is a source of the greatest joy and pleasure and of a social experience for me. And I think I heard a quote. I don't know who said it, but I was at a conference and I copied the slide because I thought it was wonderful, and I think it really applies to Italy. And for an individual, if you tell me what you eat, I will tell you what you are. In a relationship, tell me how a family eats, and I will tell you how it functions. And for a nation or in the environment, tell me how a nation eats, and I will tell you its value. And I think nothing describes Italy better than that last line. It is the value of Italians to preserve their culinary cuisine, their heritage. They're proud of who they are, regardless whatever region they're in, and they're very proud of their local cuisine, their land. And I think that that's what we all need to get back to eat more foods that are culturally relevant and that have meaning and that we derive the most pleasure and give us the most wonderful memories for ourselves and our children and our families. So, thank you.
A half-century ago, author Lawrence Durrell aptly quipped, quote, "The Mediterranean is an absurdly small sea, as the length and greatness of its history makes us dream it larger than it actually is," end quote. As the liquid connector of three disparate continents, the Mediterranean continues to dominate public discourse today, particularly in the sphere of geopolitics, with ISIS, the refugee crises, especially in Syria, and the horrific transgressions in Paris comprising the bulk of international headlines. Indeed, this region and its complex history has provided much fodder in U.S. political debate, with American presidential candidate Carly Fiorina recently affirming she will employ her medieval degree from Stanford University to fight ISIS and prevent a return to the Middle Ages, thereby invoking the Crusades and painting a somewhat parochial picture of Christians versus Muslims. This picture, however blurred, has been etched into the collective consciousness of many of us in the 21st century, partly because of the way in which we consume the Mediterranean's past from a post-9/11 perspective. The increase of trans-Mediterranean mobility following the commercial revolutions in the 11th, 12th, and 13th century, or so the narrative goes, initiated a permanent state of war and competition between regional powers, be it Muslim, Byzantine, or European, over control of the Mediterranean shores and maritime routes. And I'd like to pause briefly here and mention, I studied abroad here in Florence as an undergraduate, and my first day of class was actually September 11th, 2001. I remember it vividly. Obviously, class was canceled. I went home and I watched the events unfold in my tiny little TV set in Via Ghibellina. And you know, the dialogue I had with friends, classmates, and some of the local friends I made here, immediately after was very constructive. It was about sadness, solidarity, and community. And I think over time, over the next few months, that rhetoric transitioned into something a little more bellicose and insular, where it was more of an us versus them mentality. And this is the way it's always been, and this is the way it's always going to be. So I think this anecdotally kind of corroborates the point I was just trying to make. And in the years since 2001, there has been a flood of studies seeking to combat this aforesaid parochialism and highlight the cultural fluidity and porous boundaries that existed between the various ethnic and religious sects that populated the medieval Mediterranean. This paper constitutes a continuation of this historiographical trend. But rather than focus on the convivencia, the coexistence that many of us probably know took place in Andalusia, Spain, and the greater part of the Iberian Peninsula, which an able body of scholars has already looked at and continues to look at today, my paper explores the intellectual preoccupations of the Italian trader. And I was fortunate enough to be part of an NEH, or National Endowment for the Humanities Institute, kind of a summer think tank a couple years ago in Barcelona, Spain, where we got together really to reconceptualize our notions of cross-cultural exchanges in the pre-modern Mediterranean, particularly between Christians and Muslims and Jews. Now, historians have long recognized Italian dominance in Mediterranean commerce during the late Middle Ages, and you'll see in just a minute, I'm really focusing between 1275 and 1450. In recent years, studies have greatly enriched our understanding of how cross-cultural communication helped foster Italian mercantile relations in foreign markets. Yet surprisingly, a corpus of material that constitutes what I find to be a very important record of the Italian merchant's education and understanding of Islamic, or the so-called Saracen culture, remains untouched. Pratiche della mercatura, or simply put, manuals of commercial practice. These handbooks, widely circulated throughout central and northern Italy, contain vital information pertaining to the merchant's understanding and awareness of Islamic cultures and customs, really outside the realm of commercial affairs. And so in the next 15 minutes, right, 15? I would like to propose, based on my preliminary research conducted in Florence and Barcelona, new ways of reading these texts, in which I'll be citing examples from a very widely diffused manual, as well as discussing how I would like to expand the ways in which we classify this genre of manual, or practica. And in doing so, I'll be focusing on two sets of texts which I have recently ascribed as merchant manuals. Indeed, the cross-cultural understanding and exchange integrated into these manuals, I think with more research, can perhaps be construed as imperative tools used by the Italian merchant in negotiating trade. But before I explore these texts, I think it's important to pause briefly to understand how one defines a merchant manual and how this genre has evolved in tandem with recent historiography. Now, Italian merchant manuals purportedly included material deemed most important in the commercial affairs of a merchant. The 18th century historian Francesco Pagnini first classified the genre of practica based on the data germane to wears and tears, weights and measures, monies in exchange, and this has really been a classification adopted by subsequent scholarship even 2.5 centuries later. And for the most part, the scholarship has remained interested in extracting the financial information in order to better understand the complexities of the Mediterranean economy or the financial acumen of the Italian trader. And you can see here I kind of put together a crude snapshot of the 11 known manuals that were written in the late medieval period in Italy that have been published in chronological order, and you can see they come from the various city-states in central and northern Italy. Now, in more recent years, scholars have slowly begun to celebrate the diversity of the manual in addition to revealing a much more public audience than hitherto believed. Indeed, Marco Polo's travels, which I'm sure you may find puzzling up there, our work that I'm sure many of you know excludes statistical data entirely, has been judged the most famous merchant manual by renowned literary scholar Vittore Branca, who unfortunately never pursued this reclassification in greater detail. Now, turning to the manuals themselves, I'd like to focus first on the manual composed by the 14th century banker Francesco Pegolotti. It's called the Book of Descriptions, and he's the third one listed there that's bolded. Pegolotti was a very prominent member of the Bardi banking company, which was probably the richest and most wealthy, the wealthiest company in Western Europe in the early half of the 14th century. And he was stationed in London and Cyprus and probably composed this manual between 1310 and 1340. And what's important about Pegolotti's manual is that it's one of the best preserved merchant texts. And fully transcribed, it's about 400 pages. It's incredibly long. But more importantly, we see that many manuals subsequent to this on all areas of Italy copied generously from Pegolotti, suggesting that it had a very significant merchant audience. Now, Pegolotti's Book of Descriptions is replete with financial data from commercial cities around the Mediterranean. And I'd like to read just a brief excerpt from this manual that I think really paraphrases about 60% of what we see in most traditional manuals. So in comparing the measurements of acre of Syria with Constantinople, we read, quote, 1 cantor of acre equals 438 heavy pounds in Constantinople, 100 heavy pounds an acre is equivalent to blah, 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 blah. It's really just boring. And again, not boring for the economic or financial historian, but probably close to 300 pages of that back to back to back. As you can see, it collates units of measurement from all major commercial cities, then translates them into Italian units. But interspersed in these chapters, the merchant was furnished with cultural guides as well, and this is what I find most interesting. For example, the Italian merchant was provided with extensive philological guides in foreign languages, including Persian, Armenian, Arabic, Mongolian, and Cumanic, or basically Turkish. Obviously, these guides translate a whole host of commercial terms from banker to market to woolen cloth, but they also translate words such as mosque and Muhammad. Indeed, in the foreign land of Cathay, or China, Pegolotti advises the reader to grow a beard when conducting trade in woolen products so as not to appear too foreign to the Tartar or Asian sellers. He also counsels the reader to dress appropriately in Alexandria, for wearing Lombard silk is a good negotiating ploy when bartering with the so-called Saracens or Muslims. Thereafter, Pegolotti encourages the merchant to hire multiple interpreters who are knowledgeable in both Cumanic or Turkish language and are preferably native. And he says, don't be too frugal, spend a lot of money on these people because they are really your key to successfully negotiating a more favorable financial transaction. And I think this resonates nicely with the recent work of Dr. Rosé Sally Crew, who has convincingly shown that diplomatic and mercantile guides were resourceful intermediaries of acculturation in the medieval Mediterranean. Indeed, Pegolotti further advises the merchant on foreign culture in his brief commentary on Eastern politics. Here we read that there are frequent transfers of lordly power between Azov and China, which typically signal bouts of disorder, and that the Europeans should be cautious when conducting trade in Asia. And for the interest of time, I'm just going to move on right now, but I think it's important to recapitulate that most of the manuals, the Italian manuals written are thereafter, and they basically use a lot of material from Pegolotti's manual. So I strongly believe that we need to examine these texts more meticulously beyond strictly their financial data. Now, I'd like to shift to reclassifying the Practica, or the manual. During my doctoral days in upstate New York, at the second flagship institution, I guess, I used to frequent Cornell University's Rare Manuscripts Library. One day I came across a 15th century Florentine compendium of manuscripts known as MS 355. I have a picture of it, but it's in my office back in Boston I forgot to bring. I called Cornell while I was at Logan Airport, and they said, "Got great news, we can send it to you, it's just going to cost $410. So I said, you know what, I'll pass. So this compendium features the word sapienza, or knowledge, on its cover, and is divided into 4 components. The first half includes financial and mathematical expositions, the first on the Florentine monetary system, looking at the florin, the lira, even the Venetian ducat. And the other part looking at the mathematical law on the rule of three, or basically how do you cross-multiply. The second half includes a copy of Visit to the Holy Places of Egypt, Sinai, Palestine, and Syria, composed by the Florentine banker Leonardo Frescobaldi upon his return from a 13-month voyage to the Holy Circuit in 1385 in the Eastern Mediterranean, as well as a copy of a work known as the Sphere, written by the Florentine silk merchant Gori prior to his death in 1435. And you can see I added those two titles to the bottom. So these are the second half of the compendium I found in Cornell. Now, I didn't think much of this collection until a dissertation grant put me back here in Florence, and I came across manuscript 818 in the Biblioteca Riccardiana just down the street that basically was the exact same thing. It included much of the same material as Cornell's MS 355, an exposition on Florentine monetary system, as well as Frescobaldi's Visit and Gorodati's La Sfera, or the Sphere. And what's so interesting about these manuscripts is that the monetary and mathematical expositions were really fundamental components of the School of the Abacus curriculum. The School of the Abacus is basically, especially in Florence, if you were an aspiring merchant, you attended the School of the Abacus between the ages of 11 and 16. It was after grammar school, and it was before you attended your apprenticeship. So, I mean, this probably had a very wide, these texts had a probably very wide audience. And although, again, the manuscripts do not inform us if these texts were actually used in that school, based on their content, we can presume that they were intended for a merchant audience. And the manuscript I found in Cornell's library has just, you know, a multiplicity of marginal notes working out the problems, taking other marginal diagrams. And so, you know, it obviously was used by the autodidact, or someone who's trying to teach himself about commercial affairs. So picking up where Vittorio Branca left off, and this is the same literary scholar who said that we should look at Marco Polo's Milione, or his travels, as the most famous merchant manual, I would like to propose that we continue to celebrate the diversity of the manual genre based on author, on audience, and content. Although Frescobaldi and Datti's texts integrate very little statistical data, they nevertheless were composed by merchants, for merchants, and disclosed, as we'll see in just a second here, important information regarding Islamic culture. Now, the first text, Visit to the Holy Places, includes a vast amount of detailed information concerning Eastern Mediterranean geography and history, Christian theology, commercial counsel, as well as a palpable interest in things Islamic. Frescobaldi, for example, composes chapters entitled Customs of the Saracens, A Muslim Wedding, A Muslim Feast, How a Muslim Ruler Receives a Foreign Merchant, and they all indicate a very genuine interest in the way Muslims functioned. And his commercial guidance seems to reflect this interest. When describing the commercial value of Damascus, he notes that, and these are also my own rough translations, quote, "And so of all the trades there are the most perfect and great masters, and truly the order they have among them is a beautiful and noble thing," and shortly after records, "Here is made a great deal of silk cloth of every kind and every color, and if you desire to exchange, remark to the Saracen that it is the most beautiful and best in the world," end quote. Frescobaldi is even more appealing to read further on. After describing the commercial goods of Cairo and Egypt, he records, and this is what really kind of blew me away, quote, "And know you that the Saracen merchants pay reverence to the Virgin Mary, and to St. John the Baptist, and to St. Catherine, and to all the patriarchs of the Old Testament. And they hold Christ to be, after Mohammed, the greatest prophet, and that he was not born of the corruption of the flesh, but that the breath of God the Father, by the mouth of the angel, gave flesh to the divine word, and in many things they, the Saracens, draw near to our faith." End quote. Thereafter, Frescobaldi proffers a fascinating section on Egyptian customs. Here he compares the demographic and topographic makeup of Cairo and Florence. He saw a lot of similarities in the urban planning of these two cities. And we learn about proper etiquette when dining with Saracens, and actually how to interact with a sultan if a merchant was ever to grace his presence. Now, the second text found in these compendiums, the Sphere, I have discovered was one of the most copied texts of 15th century Florence, where today there survives over 200 manuscript copies in European and North American archives. Now, as I noted earlier, the Sphere is written by the silk trader Gorodati, who was kind of your classic rags to riches story here in Florence in the early part of the 15th century. And he conducted a lot of trade in the Mediterranean, mostly in the Iberian Peninsula, I think particularly Valencia and Sevilla. But what's unique about the Sphere is that it's a poem. The work is divided into 4 books, where each book is composed of 36 stanzas set in octave rhyme. So A, B, A, B, A, B, C, C, just like Boccaccio's Decameron. The first book explores, and I'll just give you a brief overview of what it looks like. This is from one of the best preserved copies of La Sfera in the Newberry Library in Chicago. The first book explores the cosmos of the universe, and as the poem progresses, Dati narrows his lens on the Mediterranean, where Book 4 presents a hybrid portolan, or basically a book of sailing instructions, that incorporates very medieval map-like characteristics. And you can see on the left-hand side there kind of the spherical rings that represent the spheres that make up the universe that's finite, that's ordained by God. And on the right, that's the start of Book 4, the last book of La Sfera, taking the readers on kind of a coastal journey around the Mediterranean. And again, he starts at the Strait of Gibraltar, and that's actually where we are on the right-hand side there, in the northwest coast of North Africa. And he takes the reader along the North African coastline to the Eastern Mediterranean, ending in the Black Sea, where he stops at various commercial and biblical locales. Significantly, Dati basically omits the entire continent of Europe from his journey, focusing exclusively on the African and Asian continents. In his text, Dati gives ample attention to the Saracens in these regions. Indeed, he dedicates an entire stanza to the city of Mecca and the importance it holds for the Muslim faith. Shortly after, he notes the commercial magnitude these Saracens held in the cities along our coastal route. In describing Alexandria in Egypt, Dati records, quote, "It is a rich land, noble and perfect, and a great port for merchandise, a place where Saracens trade with great dignity," end quote. Further north on the Eastern Mediterranean coast, the reader discovers that, quote, "From Beirut, among this land, it takes a day and a half to that great city, that in all the world is much ordained, a land of merchandise that is made of great Muslim nobility, who are both powerful and rich. Damascus, this city is called," end quote. And there's still more, but I'm going to wrap things up right now. So my purpose here is not to portray a one-sided picture of the Italian merchant's perception of foreign cultures. Frescobaldi and Dati can be quite critical of Muslims. At various points in their respective texts, they refer to the so-called Saracens as pagans, and they even talk about strategic ways of taking back the Holy Land. Obviously, this is coinciding with the Crusades. Aforesaid material I have cited, Frescobaldi and Dati both provide interesting insight into these foreign cultures that was seemingly available to a wide merchant audience. These ambiguous passages perhaps reflect the recent work of Stephen Epstein, who has convincingly shown how economic self-interest often trumped the barriers of color prejudice or religious affiliation and created common ground across major barriers of faith and language in the Eastern Mediterranean. In conclusion, I must stress that this project is a work in progress and is still in need of further research. Nevertheless, I strongly believe that a rereading of the traditional merchant manual, in conjunction with a broadening of the genre based on author, audience, and content, can illuminate a multiplicity of things related to the medieval Italian merchant's understanding of foreign cultures in the Mediterranean and how acculturation may indeed have been instrumental in negotiating trade. Thank you.
Basically, I wanted to show how historiography or history writing on the Mediterranean also raises the problems of historiography tout court, the problems and the tensions within them. And the genre as such, history writing as a discipline and a genre, has very porous boundaries, it seems to me. On the one hand, there's the high road of the philosophy of history, in which you have big ideas like evolution, progress, salvation, the working class. And on the other hand, on the low road, history bumps into and embraces the social sciences, such as anthropology, sociology, and psychology. Now, we also know that historians like to write well and wisely, which means they're very much involved with discourse and rhetoric. That reminds us, of course, also that history has a twin named literature, which involves history in rhetoric, the art of rhetoric as well. I want to also suggest the provocative idea that Werner Sombart threw out about history, saying no theory, no history. Now, you may not want to accept that idea that history has to agitate over theory too much, but also the early geographers were embracing or deploying many different kinds of skills: astronomy, demography, cartography, and they were also kind of doing ethnography, geoethnography, historians. So that, I think, that kind of epistemic parameters carries over into the challenge that any historian, I think, would have to face. I'm cutting out the Greek historians and so on, but I would like to mention two historiographical extremes. I'll leave out one in particular that I would have liked to, Noel Malcolm's new book on the 16th century Albanian family, two Albanian families, the Bruti and the Bruni, who worked in the service of the Serenissima and were translators, dragomen. And the book is a fascinating tug of war between microhistory and all the problems that suggests, and his attempt also to do macrohistory. He wants it both ways. So what I will do at any rate is say a few words about Brodel, whom probably will be a kind of ghost in the room as we go along. And then on the other hand, I would like to say something about a volume of microhistory by Nathalie Zeeman Davis. Now, on Travel Trickster, on Leo Africanus, translated by Giambattista Ramuzio. At any rate, what's fascinating about Brodel's masterpiece of 49 on the Mediterranean is this revolution that he did in combining into one concept space and time, space-time. And then he fragmented it. He pounded it together the way a modernist artist would at the beginning of the century. And he fractured space-time into three different orders. And these orders, you probably are acquainted with the longue durée, which has already been mentioned. And this is a kind of history that doesn't move. It's a history that is devoted to the environment and geography and the landscape and the climate and so on. This, I think, is the most important level, admittedly, for Brodel, for which he has been accused of perhaps environmental determinism. But he has two other dimensions, and he holds them in tension, as Paul Ricoeur says in Temps and Récit, in a beautiful excursus on the volume. The second one is l'histoire conjoncturelle, conjunctural history, which deals with economies primarily. If you look at the table of contents, you see economies is very important. But it also deals with civilizations and societies. Then he has, of course, the third one, which is Histoire événementielle, or event history. And of course, this has produced a remark of his that has become famous. Events are simply dust in your eyes. But the point about these that shows you the art of historiography as far as Brodel is concerned is that these three dimensions, however separate, and however they require different forms of competence, nevertheless are held in tension. There's a very good student of Brodel, Hans Kellner, back in the 80s, wrote a critique of Brodel to show that actually there's a strong dynamic image in Brodel, and that is the wave. The wave appears everywhere in the interstices, And at a certain point when he talks about civilizations and the way they war and make peace, war against each other and make peace, that he talks about a kind of Brownian motion, literally. He also talks about irradiation, and if you look at his book, linguistically speaking, then the metaphorics are truly amazing. At one point, however, he does say that this Brownian motion also includes components like a single autobiographical or biographical trajectory that crosses the Mediterranean, and this, he says, is an adventure, and it's a wager. So that this form of, we might call it geohistory, and culture becomes geoculture, if you will. A good student of his from Italy, who was also a dear friend, Ruggero Romano, talks about this kind of history being total history, an attempt to do total history. An incredible grasp, anyhow. Well, I mean, if you're acquainted with the book by Jared Diamond, In Guns, Germs, and Steel, he talks about these fertile crescents and the different Mediterranean climates in the world. There are 4 different types, but the Mediterranean climate, which is around the Mediterranean, North Africa, and so on, produces, has domesticated very early on a number of fruits, such as the date, the olive, the fig, and the date palm, the grape, also I should add. And it also includes 8 founder crops, such as emmer wheat, einkorn wheat, a number of pulses like lentil, pea, chickpea, bitter vetch, and flax, and barley. And these were all instrumental in launching agricultural in this Mediterranean zone. This same zone also had the 4 species of big mammals. Jared locates these, and he talks about the various aspects of the zones, the high diversity of wild plants and animal species, climatic variation, etc. And these square up rather nicely with Brodell's first part 1 of his book on the Mediterranean, on the environment. I would also suggest an interesting confrontation between Jürgen Osterhamel's history of the world history of the 19th century, in which he has a very interesting cartography of concepts, and space is very important, and he talks about Brodell there. And then he also suggests a series of very specific methods devoted to types of space. So Robert's talk this morning too connects up with that in an interesting way. At any rate, I mean, as far as geocultural determinism goes, one can see that this common space, is very influential in conditioning our notion of culture and history. Now, the other text, the other extreme I wanted to mention, because we have to, I'm running here, literally in my mind and my tongue. But the microhistorian, the school of microhistory, of course, microstoria, the Italian response to the Annals school, is a fascinating and powerful school of historiography. The text I wanted us to look at is that of Natalie Zeman Davis, and her relationship, of course, with Carlo Ginzburg. Carlo Ginzburg included in his latest, not his latest book is actually on the image, horror and terror, using pathos formen, A.B. Warburg's, the great Florentine German from Hamburg. This school of history really wants to start from a single life, or the micrological scale, a very small scale, and possibly produce what Brodel, quoting Croce, thought would be a way of bringing microhistory up to the macrohistorical level by saying, if you analyze any event, you're going to find possibly all of history there. All of human history in an event. That sounds very Marxian or Hegelian, and it is in a certain sense, and it certainly shows that Croce's idealist influence, but it could be Marxian as well. But apart from that attempt to pass from one level to another, with all the danger that implies, what microhistorians do is work with hypotheses and work as sleuths, really. They raise a lot of questions, and they foreground the gaps in the archive and in the research, and go where they must through context and analogy to fill in the gaps that they don't know. Now, Zeman Davis does this with a very interesting character who wrote on La descrizione dell'Africa in Ramuzio's Navigazione et Viaggi in the middle 1500s. It's a big 3-volume work, prototype for all Renaissance collections of travelogues for Hakluyt purchase, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. One of the things she notes in her preface is that in order to do this microhistory and feel confident about it without dealing with binary categories, is to take a number of categories from post-colonial critique, such as those of the notion of hybridity from Homi Bhabha, Richard White's notion of the middle ground. He cites also Paul Gilroy. So she's done this kind of work, and she's very cautious, and it's very hard to deal with Leo Africanus, who also calls himself Al-Hassan ibn Muhammad al-Wasan, or Yuhanna al-Hassad. So there's a business where he signs his name differently. He was captured actually in 1518 on an ambassadorship from Fez in Morocco to Cairo by Spanish soldiers and given as a prisoner to Pope Leo X, where he had access to the Vatican libraries. And after a year, he converted and then he was let free and began to travel to Viterbo, Rome, of course, Bologna, and up to Venice, and so on. And supposedly he went back to Africa around 1527, and after that we don't hear very much about him anymore. So there's a lot of conjectural work, and if you read that text, you'll have a wonderful understanding of the participant observer aspect of the microhistorian. Not now above the ecumene the way Brodel would, with his beautiful use of the map of the Mediterranean turned upside down in order to defamiliarize the Mediterranean and put the emphasis on Africa with its big, heavy continent weighing down on the northern shores of the Mediterranean. Now, those, I would simply say that the point I would like to raise, and I think we'll be talking about this a lot, is the problem of scale and how to be aware of that, and not necessarily to offend the kind of tension between the levels. Now, I would like to talk about images for historians and how the media sphere has challenged history to begin to use scenario visualizations or geovisualizations. And this becomes important. I think a good transition text would be the work of the Siegfried Krakauer's book, History, The Last Before the Last Things, in which he talks about the law of levels. And these law of levels he gets from modernist cinema theory by using the notion of the close-up, the zoom in, the fade out, and so on. And I think what he does is also, I was talking with Mark Abate earlier, that in 1905, Johann Huizinga tried to put the image in the center of the writing of history through his notion of Denkbilder, or thought images, which Walter Benjamin picked up much later. But the theory of the image and the deep image and how that picks up a lot of elusiveness is theorized by Huizinga in his 1905 inaugural lecture at Groningen, where he took the chair of history. Now, we should also remember, as Robert Saunders was telling us, that history, at least in Brodel, often relies on the function of description. The function of description and exposition relies on the rhetorical tropes of accumulatio, evidentia, enargeia, and these tropes are to make us see what isn't present before the eyes. Now, this notion of rhetoric being totally involved in the work of configuration allows us to move to an understanding of images which is part of the same qualitative scale. We don't have to say images are something else and historical discourse is something else. No, actually, they're intrinsically involved in the same work of configuration. Now, Brodel's big work of 49, which he revised a number of times, the second edition being much more important and reworked. The purpose of that book was actually to say the Mediterranean is no longer important. With the discovery of the route around the Cape of Good Hope to the Indian Ocean for the spice trade, the movement to the Americas and the West Indies, put the emphasis on Northern Europe and the Atlantic. And the Mediterranean, even though economically and politically it thrived, Venice, for example, thrived very well into the 1600s and continued its trade. This new Mediterranean, I wanted to return to by closing, by showing you a number of images which I think now historians must come to terms with and want to come to terms with. The figure one is famous, and it forced European leaders to change immigration policy, so much so that if you read this is the young anonymous child when it was on 3rd of September, who was drowned off the shores of Bodrum, Turkey, on his way to the Greek island of Kos. This image immediately received global circulation, and it was scandalous and shocked people. It's easy to see why. And this image, in a certain sense, I think is shocking because it zeroes in on this single body, the single detail, and it's a close-up. It's a very close-up. It's almost like doing microhistory, but it's not really about story yet. It's a study, if you will. I think this isolation and this magnification of this little boy on the beach, figure 2, is what makes it, I think, so shocking.